I'm not a religious person, and the reason I'm not is because I don't have faith in human beings who claim to be prophets. To be a religious person, you need faith in other human beings, and that's the only thing you need faith in to be a religious person. You don't need faith to believe in God, to know God exists. You don't need faith. And I'm going to prove that to you. And religious people won't like what I'm going to say. Ironically. Remember that edgy teen? Maybe you were that edgy teen. Remember that edgy teen who was like, oh, well, if God created everything, then who created God? Well, the reason that's an argument, it's a good argument. The reason that's a good argument is because both that atheist teen and the religious person view God as a ghost-like substance up there in the clouds or in space. A ghost-like substance, a person, basically a human being with superpowers. A supernatural entity that is kind of like a ghost, human. Maybe it's really giant. Maybe it's a giant human being with superpowers. You get the point. That's called dualism because there's a duality between the physical body and the ghost substance, consciousness, spirit, whatever, that exits your body because it can, because it's separate, because it's dualism. Now, the edgy teen argument, if God created everything, then who created God? That is not an argument against religion or against God. That is an argument against dualism. It's kind of a new argument. And the reason is because religion has been monist throughout human history until very recently in the West, in the past few decades or a few generations. Religion is seen through a dualistic lens only very, very recently. And that's why this argument, this edgy teen argument, becomes an argument against religion itself, because religion itself has become dualist. Look up the concept divine simplicity. This is the best argument to prove that religion is monist. It is blasphemy to anthropomorphize God, to view God as a ghost being up in the sky, as kind of like a human being. What people do today, religious people in the West, what people do today is they anthropomorphize God. They say, oh, I wonder what God is thinking. Stuff like that. Or questions like, well, if God's so good, then why did he create evil? And then the word create, there's a new meaning attached to the term creation in only recent history. Creation is now used in the human sense, as in, I grabbed something and rearranged it. See, that's the thing about humanity. Humanity doesn't really create anything, does it? It just kind of rearranges things, materials. Whereas if you use the word creation in the divine sense, that means you are making it come into existence. So there's a recent influx of dualism on our culture, both in religion and out of it. So I just wanted to point that out first. So that edgy teen argument, if God created everything, then who created God? That is an argument that kind of helps prove the existence of God. Because that argument is against dualism. It specifically is pointing out the infinite regression or infinite regress within the dualistic ontology. There are 4 different positions you can have ontologically. There's only 4, and one of them is more correct than the others. 3 of them have infinite regress, and one of them does not. And that's how you prove God exists. Okay? Monism does not have infinite regress, and monism includes God, so therefore God exists. So let me explain that in simple terms. Let me explain that in simple terms so anyone can understand this. Okay? You won't hear these kinds of arguments from religious people. Okay? So, in dualism, there are a few different categories. There's physical and non-physical. You have physical over here, non-physical over here. And the reason you have categories is because when you're trying to understand the world around you, the nature of being, then you're doing ontology. You're trying to make sense of reality in general. And there's a certain process that the human brain goes through inevitably. And it's the same process. And you always end up in one of the 4 end locations. So, to make sense of the world around you, what we do is we categorize things, and then we use a kind of reduction by grouping the category, making the categories more and more broad, so that eventually we can understand, well, what are the basic categories and what are their relationships. So you could start off with, for instance, peanut butter and jelly. So you have the category peanut butter and jelly, and you could say, okay, those are my categories. Those are my conjugate categories. And then someone says, well, actually those 2 categories fall under the same category, stuff you put on a sandwich. And then, so there's stuff you put on a sandwich, and then the conjugate category for that is stuff you don't put on a sandwich. So now you have 2 categories again, broader categories. Conjugate categories. And then someone comes along and says, well, you can kind of put those 2 categories in the same category. Again, here's stuff you use to put on sandwiches and stuff you don't put on sandwiches. You put them together into the category stuff. And then, so you have a bigger category called stuff. And then there's the conjugate category called not stuff. And then that's basically where people end up. Okay, it's a really simple process. I just did it right there. It doesn't take very much. It's called ontology, but it's a really basic concept that everyone does all the time. So we have the categories now, stuff and not stuff, and if you want to be academic about it, you could label the categories physical and non-physical, and that's usually how people refer to those categories. So dualism is viewing the world as 2 separate categories that are not connected whatsoever. One is physical, one is not physical. So then someone comes up to you and asks you, well, explain how the physical category came into existence. Explain what the physical category is made out of, where it came from. How does it work? The physical category. And then the dualist might say, well, the non-physical category made it appear into existence, like bippity boppity boo, magic, whoosh, like that, with the magic wand. And so like the non-physical category, whatever you want to think of it, like consciousness or whatever, made the physical category pop into existence. Okay, so that explains the physical category. Got it. Okay, so now explain the non-physical category. See, that's where you run into issues. You can't do the same thing for the other category. You have to think up of some other BS. So that's what the edgy teen question is. If God created everything, then who created God? So okay, you've explained that the physical category exists. Now explain this category. And so a dualist will never, ever attempt to answer that question because, and only because, not because they don't want to, but because it's literally impossible. And I'll tell you why it's impossible, because the category of non-physical was never, ever defined to be made out of something else. It was always intended to be the base category, and yet when someone says, well, what's the base category made out of? You can't do anything about it. So there's other ways you can end up as you go through the ontological process of rearranging categories in your head. And when you do this, you really do want to explain everything. So you do have a tendency to say, well, this category made that category, because you want to reduce the number of categories there are. So you can explain, like you could say, okay, everything's this one category, and everything makes sense. It's a way for people to, for things to make sense in people's minds. But, the more you think about it, a lot of this stuff doesn't make sense. Dualism just doesn't make sense. If you actually address this issue, what makes up the non-physical category, then dualism just doesn't make sense. It made sense for a while because it explained the physical category, but if you think about it a little bit more, it doesn't really make sense. And everyone else does the same thing. Now, even the edgy atheist teenager does the same thing and has his own version of infinite regress. Because maybe the atheist teen is a physicalist. So let's take a look at physicalism real quick. Let's say I'm having a conversation with a physicalist. I say, okay, physicalist, explain the non-physical category. Explain the non-physical category. The physicalist says, oh, well, that's easy. The non-physical category is a subset of the physical category. See? So, boom. Explain the non-physical. Boom, he did it. He explained the non-physical category. So then I say, okay, that's great. Now explain the physical category. All right? So the same thing happens. It's called infinite regress. The category of physical was never defined to be made up of anything, so it is just assumed that everything is made up of physical, and then there's an infinite regress. So, for instance, what is that thing? What is that made out of? Well, that's made out of physical particles, obviously. Okay, well, what are those physical particles made out of? Well, obviously, those physical particles are made up of even smaller physical particles. Okay, but then what are those smaller physical? You get the point. It just keeps on going forever. Infinite regress. And that's because just the concept of physicality as a category, an ontological category, is simply defined as not being made up of anything. Infinite regress. The same happens with idealism, except it's the other way around. Let's say I'm talking to an idealist. There's two categories, physical and non-physical. I ask the idealist, explain the physical category. And they say, that's simple. It's a subset of the non-physical category. I say, great, but can you now explain the can you now explain the how the category of non-physical came into existence, or what it's made out of, or how it works? They can't do it because the same problem. The concept of non-physical as an ontological category was never defined as something that was made up of other things. What they say is usually like, well, you are God, and your consciousness makes up everything. So what makes up consciousness? Well, like vibrations or something. Well, what makes up vibrations? And what is a vibration? What does it mean when you say vibration? And what are the vibrations made out of? Where did they come from? Why do they do what they do? And I've actually had this conversation with idealists, and their answer was literally smaller vibrations. Okay, you can't make this stuff up. What causes the vibrations? Smaller vibrations. What causes those vibrations? Smaller. You get the point. It's called infinite regress. It's the same issue every single time. The same issue. Well, if God created everything, who created God? Infinite regress. Okay, the solution to that is monism, because monism doesn't have that problem, does not have infinite regress. The way I understand it, this is coming from me, okay? The way I understand it is that there's infinite regress here and there's infinite regress here because this category was never defined as being made up of something. And so you cannot ever, you'd have to redefine the category itself. So that is actually the solution, is to redefine the categories. And the way to correct, the only way to make sense of things, to make the right categories, is to define the categories as stuff that's made up of stuff and stuff that makes up other stuff. So how else would you word that? Well, you could say, here's stuff that's the stuff that's described, okay? Stuff that is described, and then over here in this category, descriptions. So the academic words for those categories are essence and substance. Substance being defined as being made up of essences, and essences being defined as making up substances. Okay? So there's something special, there's something different about these two categories. Forget physical and non-physical. We don't care about those categories anymore. As far as we're concerned, those are not categories. And it's just completely imaginary. And subjective, not even real. Not real. And not representative of reality, obviously, if you end up into infinite regress. Okay, so there's something special about these categories. These categories are interdependent. You can't have one without the other. For example, let's say you want to describe something. So you go to describe something, so you go over to this category and you pluck out a description. You need a description. If you want to describe something, you need to use a description. You can't describe something without this description, and vice versa. If you want to go and grab a description, if nothing is described, then where are the descriptions? So they're categories that are interdependent. You cannot have one without the other. You can't have one over here and one over there. They're always in tandem. So that brings us to the true meaning of monism, meaning a single category, one category. Because if these two categories, these interdependent categories, are really like that, then that's actually not two distinct categories. It's actually just one category. In the truest sense, it's only one category. So what is that one category? Well, you understand the concept. Now all you have to do is put a name to it. The concept, let's go over it again real fast. The concept is that they're interdependent. You can't have one without the other. Why is that? Why can't you describe something without a description? Why? Why not? Because of this one single category, which is the fabric of reality. Why not? I don't know. I didn't write the rules. It's just the fact. That's just how the world works. That's just how reality is. I didn't choose for it to be that way, but that's just how it works. And a lot of people have come up with a lot of different names for this one category, because this concept is not new. It's not just coming from me. This is a very, very old concept that's been around forever. Most religions throughout 99% of history have understood this concept and have taught it. It's only until very recently that people do not understand this concept. So this category has been named a lot of different things. You can call it whatever you want. But usually the term for it is God.